like to welcome everybody and call to order the regular meeting of the Planning and Zoning Board for the Village of Pinehurst on June 6, 2024. The time is 4 o'clock. My name is Matt Jones, and I will be chairing tonight's meeting. It's good to see you all. We do have a quorum this evening. We don't have any official business to conduct, except one. We have some minutes that we need to approve from our last meeting. So before we do that, I'll let the board members introduce themselves, starting from the right. All can help you. He's really good at microphones.
You have the touch. Louise Mercuro.
Paul Roberts.
Jeremy Hooper.
Carol Henry.
Tom Schroeder.
Okay. I do want to acknowledge that today is the 80th anniversary of D-Day, June 6, 1944. Significant day in history. Thankful to all those service members that fought. 4,500 men died that day on the beaches of Normandy. So we will approve the meeting minutes from our April 4th regular meeting. Everyone should have received a copy prior to today. Any comments or changes on those minutes? If not, then does anyone care to make a motion with respect to the minutes of the regular Planning and Zoning Board meeting held on April 4th, 2024?
I make a motion to approve.
Motion made by Tom and second by Sonia. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. And the minutes are approved from the April 4th, 2024 regular meeting of the Planning and Zoning Board. The next item on the agenda is new business. The new business today is board training. Exciting, we have all four of you here. Who will be leading us today in our training?
Well, actually, that would be all four of us, but I will get us started.
Thank you.
Obviously, most of you guys, and we're thankful for those of you who are able to, with your schedules, to attend some recent training offered by the University of North Carolina School of Government. As many of you may recall, that they typically do a rotating schedule with some of their board training focused on different topics each year. This year was focused on the legislative type decisions. Obviously, you guys, functioning as a Planning and Zoning Board, do make legislative decisions and, or at least recommendations. And so coming out of that, without any other official business to be brought before the board this month, in coordination with Jeremy and Matt as chair and first vice chair respectively, we decided to throw a little sort of overview, if you will, on the agenda today. And Maria next to me, next to her, Michael, and Pam on the end, obviously collaborated on this quick journey that we will be your pilots on today to kind of go through. And hopefully a lot of this is refresher for you guys, especially those who just recently attended the School of Government training. But nonetheless, it could be useful. It's going to be something that we're going to be able to save, and I think it's going to be a good tool and another resource that we will be able to share with new members as they're welcome to this board and the Board of Adjustment. You guys, of course, operate as a dual board, Planning and Zoning Board members and Board of Adjustment, so we'll be able to touch on a little of that, as well as some of the governing board roles and some of your other colleagues as advisory board members with the village. So again, planning and land use decisions overview. I'm going to hope this clicker works. There we go. So some topics we'll cover. We'll kind of start with zoning and zoning authority, and then types, and then the types of decisions, and kind of more involved in the type of decision. We're going to talk about the process and procedure, the nuances with those types of decisions, what your role specifically is in those type of decisions, again, roles of other officials in the government, and public involvement, right? That's a very important thing that we need to cover, and as we've all witnessed in this very room, our public does get involved, and that's probably a good thing. That means better government. All right, so a little humor to kind of get us started, right? Break the ice. You don't have to, it doesn't take long if you Google zoning memes or planning memes to find out really what the sentiment out there is, right? You see this one right here with the little girl, that says a lot. Luis, I'm sure that seems, hits home for you in your years of experience. Property rights. You know, we value property rights. North Carolina is very heavily leaning on property rights, and rightfully so. You know, there's, you know, we have a lot of rights that are given to each individual, and that translates whenever we own and purchase property. But also zoning is a tool where it can be mismanaged. Local governments can get a little too far. So there's always this constant struggle, and then there's always this perception out there, right? Zoning is not unconstitutional. It's been upheld several times in courts. And I also think that this one in the middle kind of hits home too, that whenever you're making these type of land use decisions, you know, there are rights that we cannot infringe upon. So it is legal, but you can't go too far with it, right? And you may not be able to see, here's another funny image I was able to come across. So you want to do a zoning change or a permit, it gets denied and says, okay, well, what are your other options? And, you know, we go, oh, you got several options, right? But usually the way it's heard on the other end is, yeah, I've got a lot of options, but none of them are good. Okay, so with that, we're going to talk a little bit about enabling legislation, right? Here in the state of North Carolina, we are not a home rule state, which means that we only have the authority in which the General Assembly has given to local jurisdictions, to counties and municipalities. So one state, Luis asked who has home rule. One state closest to us, South Carolina, of course, does. We hear a lot about, you know, well, we like how Charleston does this or Hilton Head does that. Well, they have a lot more latitude than what local governments in North Carolina can. That's just to name one that hits close to home. So our enabling statutes are largely housed under Chapter 160D in the North Carolina General Statutes. Back in 2019, Chapter 160D was enacted into law, and this was after years and years of a lot of hard work and effort to consolidate where a lot of county enabling legislation had been housed under a different chapter, and municipal enabling legislation were housed under another chapter. Now, there's still things still covered in chapters 160A and various other places regarding annexations, for example, and some other aspects of local government. Limited grant of power, specifically under Article 7 there, 160D 702. This says local jurisdictions can adopt zoning in line with these sort of parameters. So that's where we always go to when we're trying to create some sort of new legislation. Are we comfortable that we're within our bounds of what the legislature says you can and cannot do? Additionally, Chapter 160D says if you're going to enact and adopt zoning regulations, then now you've got to adopt and reasonably maintain a comprehensive plan. So they recognize the importance of having a comprehensive plan, knowing that that's not the actual law of the land, but that sets forth your community vision. What do you aspire to be? So then you can use zoning to try to help be that vehicle to get you closer to that vision. Comprehensive plans are also defined, or you can also adopt other plans. I think this group is pretty familiar with a couple of recently adopted plans by the village, and those are the small area plans and form-based guidance plans. Previously, we had the New Core Master Plan, which was sort of a precursor to the Village Place small area plan, if you will. So again, it kind of, what that can do, small area plans can dial down a little bit more from the 60,000-foot levels, typically at the comprehensive plan level, maybe down to a 30,000-foot level, right? And those regulations are typically housed in two areas: your zoning regulations, your zoning map, and the zoning text. So there's our colorful zoning map. Every jurisdiction that has zoning has one of these. They're required to keep one, required to keep up with it, be custodians of their own records, and make this available to anyone who needs it. So what this does is it set forth the boundaries and those typical zoning districts. So you can look up what a property is zoned. That's step one. Once you figure that out, then you can go to step two. Other zonings, you think, we have a historic district overlay. So that's another tool to local governments in the state. The General Assembly has always recognized the history and tradition of the state of North Carolina as important and a heritage to keep up. And there's a lot of ways you can tell story. Matt very appropriately entered the meeting, discussing about a significant event in history. Architecture can also tell that story. And local historic districts are a good way for local governments to kind of manage historic preservation through a little bit more of architectural control. And then for other reference here, we kind of use the form-based districts through the small area plan process to kind of enact a new boundary, if you will. Not quite like an overlay, which we had set forth, but there again, it just shows how the zoning maps can be used. Okay, the text. So you know what your property's owned. Your next step is you got to know what you can and can't do or what the parameters are. So our zoning text is the Pinehurst Development Ordinance, or the PDO. It applies to what and when you need a permit or permission to do something on your private property. If it says you need a permit to do something, then that starts the whole process. If I need a permit, then these regulations apply. Or it can say that you don't need permit or permission from the local jurisdiction, therefore you don't need to read any further. And again, it must be adopted in accordance with that limited grant of power in 160D 702. The zoning text and the maps are both adopted and amended by the governing board after a recommendation by the local planning board, which is usually followed also with a recommendation by the appropriate planning staff. We have some other regulatory documents too that aren't necessarily housed but sort of incorporated by reference in the PDO. Historic district, actually that should say standards and not guidelines. The framework that we've been operating under was adopted in 2019. Tom's very familiar with that at his time with Historic Preservation Commission. So if you have a historic district, you've got to have a Historic Preservation Commission, and then you've got to have adopted standards in order to carry out that process, which we'll touch on a little bit more later on in this presentation. The Engineering Standards and Specifications Manual. So this is a very detailed regulatory approach to how streets need to be constructed, sidewalks, curbs and gutter. Matt, your wheelhouse. He's very familiar with our Engineering Standards Manual. We also have a separate flood prevention ordinance, which we're going to really hope to update and bring into the 21st century. Even though it says 2006, it's pretty antiquated. And of course, that is to carry out the regulatory flood hazard areas. The municipal code, so these are other regulations too that are not zoning. These are enacted under the local ordinance for the police powers, which are within the general health, safety, and welfare. Hopefully none of you have received any notices of where your garbage cans are to be located, et cetera. Those regulations are in our municipal code.
Not recent.
So not to be confused with zoning regulations, however. They often are. And they only apply to those properties within the corporate limits, not within the ETJ.
Also, municipal code sets us up, correct?
It is, and the charter with the village. I mean, the municipal code it's a very important document. I mean, it sets forth all the administrative officers and duties. Really, in order to carry out, unless you're an elected official, which also take oaths of office. Obviously, our police, law enforcement officers have to take that oath, and a lot of what they do is housed under municipal code. And then there's a few of us in the planning staff that also are administered an oath and take an oath, the same as sworn officers do, to uphold those provisions like I mentioned. So again, comprehensive plan, you've got to have a comprehensive plan if you're going to enact zoning. Also in 2019, we adopted a updated comprehensive plan. I know this cover looks familiar to all you guys, and I felt like this sort of flow was important when we adopted the small area plans, and I think it's very important to always remember when we're enacting new legislative changes that if you have your comprehensive plan, you consider all these plans, and then it just it could be just a circle here. They all have to flow up and back down to one another. Okay, I'm going to complete this slide, then I'm going to hand it over. So now we're moving more into those types of development decisions. So land use development decisions in the state of North Carolina fall under one of three categories: administrative, legislative, and everyone's favorite, quasi-judicial. And I lied, I'm going to do one more. So big question is, well, how do you know? What makes an administrative decision? And if we want to act like everything's quasi-judicial, what tells us what is and what's not, right? Well, this can be either found be in the local ordinance, or it could be statutory. Quasi-judicial decisions like variances and special use permits, they are quasi-judicial because the statutes say they are. And we'll talk a little bit more about why it goes even further. Certificates of appropriateness as well. Legislative or your zoning text and map amendments, again, statutory. Administrative is all going to be set by your local ordinance. Again, if you need permit or approval for something based on what that zoning text says and what those parameters are. All right, so now we're going to move into administrative, and I'm going to turn it over to Pam.
Pass all the way down. So these are sort of laid out in the, I suppose, least complex to most complex. And there's a hierarchy, because you'll see that most of the quasi-judicial decisions, which is arguably the most complex, typically go to the governing board. Administrative decisions are most often staff decisions, but not always. The elected body sometimes makes such decisions, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. And one of the reasons why this is delegated to staff quite often is because the decision is based on very objective standards. It is, in a sense, a checklist. The PDO or whatever other guiding document that you have has a list of what the criteria are for approval of such a decision. And if you could check those boxes, you do grant, you do say yes to the application or to the request. Public hearings are typically not required, but it does depend on local ordinance. Sometimes they can be. And therefore, a notice of the decision is not typically given unless it's specified to be done so in the local ordinance. These decisions must be based solely on those objective standards, and there's no discretion allowed. And so it allows staff to be very comfortable making those decisions because we have guidance on what the criteria should be in order to say yes. And we do not have the authority to deviate from those standards as some higher authorities would, such as the governing board, where they have more discretion in some cases in their decision. As I mentioned before, if the standards are met, the approval must be granted, and if the standards are not met, it must be denied. Again, public participation is typically limited, not typically a public hearing that's noticed in any way, and the decision cannot be based on public input, so it simplifies things when it's more of an in-house decision. We are also bound by conflict of interest regulations by statute, just as you are in some of your decisions and as the governing board is in some of theirs. This, when we talk about having criteria to go by and guiding us in the decision, that's what you're seeing on the right. This is an example. If we are reviewing a new proposal for a new single-family home, for example, which this table highlights some of our residential zoning districts and what those dimensional standards are, what's the minimum lot size, what are the setbacks. And so it's very easy for us to go through look at a site plan and determine whether it meets those standards or not. First of all, we look to see if the use is allowed. So we have, even in the residential category, we have different types of housing, including multifamily, that might not be allowed in some of our residential districts. Other standards that we would look at before approving a proposal for a residential new construction would be parking, if it meets the parking requirements. And then examples of administrative decisions beyond just if a new house comes to us, some of the simple decisions such as fence permits, other types of zoning use permits. So if we have a new business come into town, we use the PDO to guide us in whether that particular activity that's being proposed with that business is allowed in the zoning district where they wish to go. Site plans and subdivisions, particularly the minor site plans and subdivisions that aren't elevated to you and to the governing board, and notice of violations are another example. As far as the Planning and Zoning Board's role in these types of decisions, it's not required by general statutes, but our PDO does establish a process where major subdivision and major site plans do go through you for a recommendation and then for a final decision by village council. These are also considered administrative decisions and, again, guided by the criteria in the PDO to determine whether those should receive a yes or a no at the end of the day. We categorize, and this is different in different communities, but in Pinehurst, we categorize major subdivisions as the creation of 3 lots, more than 3 lots in a subdivision where dedication of a road is proposed. And a major site plan is dictated by the size of the project area. And if the area of disturbance is greater than 2 acres, then it becomes a major site plan, which those are the ones that you see ultimately. These do require public hearings by our PDO, and so adjoining property owners receive mailed notice. There is a posting on the property and an ad in the local paper, so that it's a very transparent public process when these decisions are made. And it may feel a little more like a legislative hearing, and not every community has these types of hearings, but Pinehurst does have a very public and transparent process when these decisions are made. So it's certainly more closely related to a legislative hearing than to a quasi-judicial hearing, which is much more formal. But in this case, our ordinance establishes very clear objective standards for this decision, and that's why it falls under the administrative category. No discretion. So if it checks all the boxes, it gets an approval.
And I would like to add, when these administrative decisions are being made, staff or anyone else who is authorized to make those decisions, you cannot impose any conditions that would, you either meet the standard or that's it. You don't have to. There's no requirement. You can't put any additional conditions of approval.
And this is a rather simple flow chart. It's a rather simple process, so appropriately so, and this is where it starts. The local ordinance, in our case, does require a permit for something like a fence permit or a new single-family home. That application is submitted. Staff reviews the application. Hearing is scheduled and noticed, as we talked about before, and then there's a public hearing. This would be for those major site plans, major subdivisions, for example. And if it's determined that the proposal is compliant with the ordinance, the approval is granted, and the work can begin. And if it does not meet all the standards, then it must be revised or outright denied. So you may see cases where the Planning and Zoning Board would recommend denial. It still moves forward because that final decision is made by Village Council. Yes, sir.
A recent administrative decision that came across our board was the downzoning in the ETJs. It's different than the one we just spoke of? Okay, all right, just want to make sure, thanks.
That's downzoning, which is somewhat uncommon, but everybody seemed pleased to see it.
That was unique, but actually, there was history on that property too. It was legislative, which Michael's going to go to next, which is almost a good segue. I did fail to make mention of this on this very rudimentary flow chart-ish that I put together here. I'm not happy with it, can you tell? I thought I had placed a box on there and forgot to, about the appeal. Those last 2 points there, those decision points on the left and right, either one of those decisions, whether it's made by staff or if it's ultimately made by the governing board, like a major site plan or subdivision approval here, can be appealed to the Board of Adjustment first. So I think that's important for you guys to consider. I don't know if any of you have sat on the Board of Adjustment for an appeal. I can think of one in the past 4 years or 5 years. It was right before COVID, I believe. So anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about appeals, but administrative decisions first have to go to the local Board of Adjustment.
Did I understand correctly, Pam, that administrative decisions excluding what comes to Planning and Zoning Board don't have to go to the Governing Board for approval, but if it comes to Planning and Zoning, it then has to go to the Governing Board, or does that differentiate between legislative and administrative?
And that's just based on our local ordinance, yeah.
Okay.
Major site plans and major subdivisions are the only two administrative decisions that are elevated to the governing board, the village council, to have that decision point on that part in the process. You see there at the very end of the tealish colored box there, compliance term approval is granted and work can begin, or whatever other steps or necessary approvals are needed. That might be the first step along the process, the first approval point that you have to get to. But any of those two that are ultimately authorized to the local governing board here at the village council, you guys do provide a recommendation, but that's it. Everything else, our esteemed staff gets the ultimate pleasure of reviewing and working through and hashing out, making sure that compliance with the currently adopted standards are met.
What's the criteria, though? So something would come to the Planning and Zoning Board. It's recommended, that it does not get approved. The applicant or the individual can just request to go to the governing board, i.e. the village council.
At their peril. Because ultimately, what we would advise,
Sure,
and
yeah.
and ultimately,
Right.
legal counsel would tell them, you can't approve it.
Yeah, got it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Legislative, any other questions? I'm going to pass it to Mr. Mandeville in that case.
Okay, so I'm going to talk to you guys and ladies, about legislative decisions. Like Pam said earlier, that this is kind of maybe a little bit of a step up in what you have to do in the flow of everything. So at first, the decision will be made ultimately by the village council. That will be the ultimate decision for this. The planning board's role in this will be a recommendation to the governing board. With that being said, when we were making these decisions, you must consider all the comprehensive plans. So if it could be a bike and pedestrian plan, it could be a transportation plan, anything, comprehensive plan, small area plan, anything that we have adopted on the books that's relevant should be considered when making these legislative decisions. These decisions will involve a public hearing, which will be noticed, and there are different ways of noticing these meetings, and we'll go over that in a couple slides. Like Alex said earlier, the intent for this is to bring on public comment and feedback, because we want as much as possible from our citizens to make the correct decision and get the temperature of how people feel about these certain things. And the governing board, village council, has a wide latitude in making the final decision. So some of the examples are adopting and amending the zoning map and the text. Next.
How wide?
Great question.
I would refer to you to a training that I did with village council, although virtually, back in 2020, I believe. But no, it's got to be reasonable, right, and how that's defined. Obviously, you can't abuse the grant of power that's been given by the statutes. There are other parameters, conflicts of interest. There's nothing about, and I think Michael will get a little bit to more of this, about already having an opinion, formed opinion, or anything else biased. You just can't have a conflict. Obviously, and you can't treat someone differently based on any of, the predetermined rights that we all have.
Because I guess it seems like between administrative and legislative, if you still have standards that have to be met in legislative, but the interpretation of how it applies to these plans, comprehensive, small area, I mean, that's the subjective part that we bring because we're all different, and that's also what the council brings to their decisions.
And you're not bound if you feel, or a governing board or a planning board feels something's reasonable or consistent or not consistent with an adopted transportation plan, comprehensive plan. It may be inconsistent, but it may be worth having in the local community at that time. These comprehensive plans can't consider everything, and they have a pretty lengthy shelf life. But things change. In 5 years, a lot can change. Look at where we were 5 years ago. Look at how many things have changed since then, right?
So the consistency statement, I mean, you have to make one, but you could potentially approve it even if it's not.
Statutes say you just got to consider it. The record would have to show, and I say the record, so at least in the hearing,
Is consistent or it isn't?
and that you cracked the book.
Yep.
You looked at it. Well, the comprehensive plan says this. Whether or not a governing board finds something consistent or not consistent, that is not subject to judicial scrutiny. Just the fact that they considered it in making their decision.
Very relevant.
Wide latitude.
Okay. So on this slide, we have a couple examples of legislative decisions. The first one would be rezonings. We have two different types of rezonings, a conditional and a conventional. A conditional is basically what it says it is. You can impose conditions on the rezoning. As you see over here to the side, the map here is that's the map of the cancer center at the hospital. So it's a general concept plan, and you can impose conditions on this general concept plan before approval. A zoning map amendment, it can add site-specific conditions and standards. They can be more or less restrictive than the base zoning classification, so it's a give and take when you're going back and forth with these things. In a conventional is what it says it is. The rezoning says the applicant is afforded all that is allowed or not allowed within that zoning district. So that's when you get in your use chart and see what's allowed and what's not allowed in zoning districts. So there's no use in proposing a conventional rezoning if you're not going to fit that intent. So no specific conditions are allowed to be considered. And the next type of example would be a text amendment, and that would be to adopt, amend, and repeal parts of the ordinance of the text. So here's kind of part of the process, and you can see over to the, you like my picture? They are looking at it. They're pointing at all of us. So that's an example of a public hearing notice for a legislative decision. So you always have to notice the public when there's a legislative decision. It will be in the newspaper, it will be posted on the subject properties, it will be mailed to the adjacent property owners. And these postings, either any of them must be within a 10 to 25 day window prior to the hearing date. And again, this is to solicit as much public opinion as possible. Other opportunities for public comment on the proposed amendments will be informal neighborhood meetings. These are required before filling out an application to request a rezoning. And they are required to give us a summary of the neighborhood meeting. So the burden is placed on the applicant to do this prior to asking for a rezoning.
Member go to the neighborhood meeting?
Tanya asked, does a staff member attend the neighborhood meetings? We can, we actually had one that was scheduled last Friday. My schedule didn't overlap with the meeting, the time that they had placed, but if a staff member's available, I mean, it doesn't hurt to go in and just kind of get our first initial hearing of what the local community thinks about it. It's definitely not required, and it does state that no member of the Planning and Zoning Board nor Village Council shall attend these meetings in their official capacity. So make sure that's important for you guys to get that. And that's in the PDO.
Just add a little bit of gray to that, right, at the end? In their capacity.
Right.
Okay.
How much latitude again, right? Yeah.
Okay. So what's your role, right? You hold the initial meeting and make a recommendation to the village council. You must consider public comments, any comprehensive plans, or any other relevant plans, or any of our recommendations on this side of the table. The governing board's role is to, again, hold another public hearing and after the planning board recommendation. They also must consider all the public comments, relevant plans, staff comments, planning board recommendation. They also may adopt the amendments by ordinance, reject the proposal, or refer it back to the planning board. With all these, like we've been saying, you have to consider comprehensive plans. Any adopted plans have to be, like Alex said, show you cracked the book. At least show that you took the time to look at plans that have been, worked on, a lot of time, money, effort put on. You need to show that you have looked into those before making these decisions. The governing board, like we said, has a wide latitude when making the legislative decisions. Unlike, when we have our quasi-judicial, we ask about if there's any ex parte communication regarding the amendment or whatever we have coming to the board, but there's no restrictions for a legislative decision. Prior opinions or other biases as well. So no member of either board may participate if they have a conflict of interest, obviously. And last, here's a kind of flow of the process. And it starts with an application, which the staff will review. And we will also hand it off to the TRC, which is Public Services, Fire, Building Code, Public Utilities, Engineering. So anybody that might be involved with that will get their chance to, comment on the application. After that, we will schedule a hearing, and then we will notice it. And like we said, the type of notices will be published in the pilot, mailed to adjacent property owners, and posted on the property. After the hearing is noticed, we'll have our planning board review, which is advisory only. Then after that, we will have the governing board hearing. It's not evidentiary, so there's no need to swear in. Then there will be a vote, and then the ordinance will be adopted or rejected.
And I think it's worth emphasizing, before you get to that yellowish block there is a lot of work that takes place. We do not get anything scheduled for a public hearing, even though the applicants may not be as happy to hear that, and, it's a constant struggle in some cases. We do not get to that point until staff is satisfied with the content of the application, especially if it does involve a technical review committee or TRC committee review. We are not moving that application forward until we know it's been properly vetted. So a lot of effort and a lot of staff members have been involved, as well as applicant and anyone with an applicant's team, before we get to that point. We like to make sure everything is buttoned up before we get to that very public process, because it's a detriment to all involved if something gets sidetracked because all the Ts were not crossed and Is dotted.
Something that stands out to me in your chart, Michael, in that yellow, I mean, advisory only. We are an advisory board, but to me, that responsibility is beyond the yes and no. It's in our recommendations or denials and the comments we make, the things, I mean, we're supposed to give something to the council that aids them in making a true decision.
That is kind of a simplification of it. It's
Sure,
much more.
it just
yeah,
reminded me of that, so I appreciate that because
It's
I-
much more
yeah.
than just, they take your recommendation seriously. Yeah, it is definitely simplification.
Yeah.
And think about this, you typically, as the planning boards, get the brunt of the initial, you guys are the first forum and where folks are coming and voicing their opinions on it. Exactly. Shall we go back to September of 2023?
Oh, please.
This room was full. Every meeting space in Village Hall was full. There were 100 other people watching that hearing online. When it got to the governing board, it's a fraction of that. How many times have you guys seen the room full here? And, it's a shame because you want that same engagement, right? But as a governing board member, if I were one, I would sit there and be able to know that, again, all that activity that I mentioned that happens in the green blocks, and then a very substantial activity, even though it is advisory only, that you're considering the advice of this group who takes that first brush of public comment and feedback, you're afforded that opportunity that a lot of folks have already worked really hard on it and tried to vet this. And sometimes it's clear and sometimes it's not, and ultimately this their decision. But there's a lot that happens before it even gets to that decision point.
Bringing that meeting up, when I did the online Zoom, the guy recommended highly that the planning board should have time limits, for sure. And if it's a large crowd, to let them know that there's a maximum of so many minutes if they want to have one person, two persons, or three persons. And I think that meeting really should have taught us something.
And we did, and Jeremy, kudos again for how well you handled that meeting. But yeah, I think we had 3+ hours
Yeah.
of public comment, and they were limited to, what was that?
53 of them.
Oh, 50, you still got the copy of the sign-in sheet?
There was 57
didn't you?
signed up, and I think 4 or 5 left there. So.
But what I'm saying is they're saying even put it in the notice, like when you're sending out a notice about the meeting, you should put in there's a time limit. If you have more than one person representing, then maybe, but this is the maximum time. And I think that is important.
And I think you're right, especially if it's going to be, it's a tool that can be exercised. Some cases, you may only have 2 or 3 people, and it may be worthy to not impose time restrictions. So it's
But that's
it's
the
not
whole
as clear.
point. If you put 15 minutes maximum of whatever, then that'll work out. But I think there has to be some kind of maximum, because that meeting was, and you did a great job, but it was entirely not what it should have been in many ways. I mean, it was an argumentation of, it just wasn't as productive as it could have been if things had gotten in a time limit, I think.
It was definitely charged.
Yeah,
And-
it
and
kept getting more charged by some of the comments.
I think quite the opposite, because I think it's in the eye of the beholder, and I think that's what's going to bring us to the quasi-judicial. That's Maria's.
Before I hand it to Maria, is there any other questions for me? All right, Ms. Maria.
Right, I saved the best for last.
Of course.
Quasi-judicial decisions. So here are some fun facts. Quasi-judicial decisions can be made by the governing board or an appointed advisory board. They cannot be made by any of us, no administrative staff. They are based on established subjective standards. And as the standards are subjective, judgment and discretion is needed to make a determination. They do require an evidentiary public hearing, which has to be noticed. There is sworn testimony, and the evidence in these hearings are limited only to the facts and the application to the standards, unlike your legislative decisions. So the quasi-judicial hearings, they do require a public hearing, but it's not just a public hearing, it's an evidentiary hearing. They do have to be noticed, the same as legislative hearings, except all these require are a sign posted on the subject property, and then mailed notices to the owners, applicants, and any adjacent property owners. These hearings are not meant to solicit broad public opinion. So only factual, competent, relative testimony can be given and considered. Everyone has to be sworn in, so if you come to any of the quasi-judicial hearings, like our lovely HPC meetings, staff is sworn in, the applicant, any owners, and anyone that wishes to speak has to be sworn in. And we try to limit that to only factual testimony. That's all that you should be basing your decisions on. And anyone, only those that have legal standing in the hearing can cross-examine or refute any evidence or testimony given. And here you can see our lovely notices that are sent out. These don't require a notice in the paper, unlike the legislative. So what is an evidentiary public hearing? It's more similar to a court case. So you act kind of like a judge. You are receiving information, and you're deciding how the standards, which would kind of be like law if you were going to court, how do they apply to a particular situation? You are required to use the evidence that's presented to you and impartial judgment to make your decisions. And these hearings give you the opportunity to listen to the sworn testimony and any other evidence that's presented to you. You can question staff, the applicant, and any witnesses that come. And then you discuss whether that any evidence that's presented is competent, if it's material and substantial. The evidence can include any documentary information and witness testimony, but you can only look at the evidence that is presented to you during the hearing. So you're not like Sherlock Holmes. You can't go out and research things and look into things beforehand. Only the things that are presented to you in that hearing are things that you consider, okay? Any testimony has to be from someone that is sworn in. It has to be factual. The only time that you would hear any kind of opinion would be from an expert. If they have an expert witness, then you could hear their opinion. Otherwise, people that like to come and speak and share their opinions, you can't take that into consideration. And any material has to be based on the standards, not the character of the applicant, politics, or any of that other stuff.
So it could be beneficial to visit the site, but you can't pull up information from the site in the hearing that isn't shared in the hearing?
Yeah, so if you look at that image, you know, it's not yours, any decision maker. I don't mean to make it personal, but if you're a board who's authorized to make these decisions and there's a case before you, you don't present any facts. You don't look for facts or evidence to present one way or the other. You are just there to receive what's been given to you, call balls, call strikes, and based on what has been given to you, the burden always rests with the applicant or the owner, whoever that petitioner was, and they have the ultimate final authority to refute or cross-examine any other evidence or testimony that's been given. Once all that's over, again, you decide what's relevant, and whether or not the standards have been met. So you don't find evidence or go clue searching, or you ask questions and clarifying points to try to vet what's been given, to make sure it's relevant and factual to the case itself. Then you make the judgment call.
And I think in cases like variances or certificates of appropriateness, where you do get to go, you are allowed to go visit the sites, but it's not for you to be fact-finding, it's just for you to have a better understanding of,
Context.
yeah, what's coming before you. So the board participation, applicants, owners, and anyone with standing has the due process of rights to an impartial decision maker. So you, as a member of a board, should not come in with any prior fixed opinions. You have to be unbiased when you come here. You can't have any conflict of interest. So what would those be? You can't participate if you have a direct, substantial, or readily identifiable financial impact on the matter. You can't have a close familial, business, or associated relationship with an affected person. And you can't have any undisclosed ex parte communication or be biased. Ex parte communication, what's that? You can't be given any evidence or contacts with people outside of the hearing, because everybody needs to be aware of what's being presented. So that should be avoided. If you happen to have any, it is your responsibility to disclose that in the hearing. And here, site visits, you can go, but you can't speak with anyone on what's happening. And in that, since I think most of you get maybe the quasi-judicial handbook, it even gives you things that you can say to people in there if someone happens to approach you while you're out visiting the site. Don't talk to them about anything that has to do with the application. If you have any of those things, it's your responsibility to disclose that at the beginning of the hearing and be aware that you can be asked to recuse yourself.
Just a light little story, you know, a couple years ago during before a BOA hearing that we had, I did run across an applicant, just, you know, socially, and had no idea, and she had no idea, and we're discussing this, and she's telling me about a project she has coming up, and I'm listening all about the project. She says, oh, but Pinehurst is going to go make me sit in front of this board. I can't believe they're going to make me do that. And I got to go and ask, and I said, oh, okay. I said, what board? And she said, I don't know. And I said, ma'am, I said, I'm on that board. It was the most awkward scenario. We literally both turned around and walked away at the same time because she had been told not to discuss it. And it was an awkward, I don't know if Alex remembers it, but it was an awkward time before that meeting for me to raise my hand and say that we had a conversation, but nothing had been discussed. It was just a light little story there. Was funny.
It's inevitable. It's going to happen. It's going to happen, and that's why we have these opportunities. And they would understand because, you know, they're the one who has everything to lose. They don't want to try to go and invalidate any action that there's going to be coming upon them to listen to.
Yeah, the funny situation was the lady turned her back on me and walked away and didn't even say goodbye. And I said, okay.
Felt like she had already done something. It sounded like she was well coached.
She was concerned. She really wasn't.
Paid
She
for your
thought she
dinner,
did.
and that was it.
We know how you voted then.
All right.
I think
So
it's,
the board roles and types of decisions you may come across. You can see Planning and Zoning Board has a sad face because you don't get to participate in any quasi-judicial decisions. But I think most of you get to put on a Board of Adjustment hat. Either you are a member of the Board of Adjustment or you get to act as an alternate occasionally. So you get a smiley face because you get to participate in the fun and excitement that is a quasi-judicial decision. What are some of those things that would come before the BOA would be things like a variance or appeals of staff decisions. Council is going to see things like special use permits or conditional use permits, and our historic commission would see certificates of appropriateness. And you can take note that all of those just require a simple majority to approve, except for a variance, which does require 4/5 of the majority. A variance, all of these decisions have certain standards that you have to consider when you're looking at the material, the evidence. So for variances, you're looking at, would an unnecessary hardship result from strict application of the ordinance? Is the hardship a result of conditions that are peculiar to that particular property? The hardship can't be a result of any action taken by the owner or the applicant, and is the variance request in the spirit, purpose, and intent of ordinances. When you are looking at appeals of administrative decisions, here we're looking at evidence and law. Was the correct decision made based on the application and the criteria? Special use permits, they are looking at if the proposal is in harmony with the area, is it consistent with the applicable plans, and will neighboring property values be harmed? And then for certificates of appropriateness, is it congruous with the special character of our lovely historic district? And is it compatible, consistent, et cetera? So here we have the process. So once an application is submitted to us, staff will review that, make sure that all the necessary information is included. We will schedule a hearing, and we will send out the mailed notices, put a sign on the property. Then we get all the material together, and we send that material out to you for review. The hearing will be conducted. You get to make a determination. If it is approved, the permits can be issued, and any other approvals that are necessary can be pursued. If it's denied, no permit would be issued. It can be appealed to Superior Court, or in the case of a certificate of appropriateness, that would come to the Board of Adjustment. Lucky you. And I don't know if I'm handing this over again to Alex, or you just get to look at this chart.
Yeah, so we just kind of placed together a little sort of cheat sheet table, if you will, of types of decisions and what are some of those examples, who makes those decisions, what those standards are that would apply. Is a public hearing required? If yes, what type of notice, what type of public input, and what the intent of that public input is. Is there discretion allowed in that decision? And if you don't like the decision, who do you go to? So again, we'll make sure everyone receives a PDF copy of this
That's great.
presentation, so you can have that chart and share. And again, we'll place this, if Shelby and rest of staff can help me remember, in our onboarding checklist folder that we have when we have new members. I think it certainly couldn't hurt.
Perfect.
And that signals the end.
Any other questions for staff? That was great.
I've got
Send you
one.
an invoice. What's it worth, a nickel?
2.
Good job.
I've got one that's kind of related. It's not directly to this stuff, but where do we stand on the PDO rewrite schedule?
So I actually made probably what I'm going to call my next to last little tweaks on the RFQ, based on some of the feedback I've gotten with council and updating some dates and projections for the project. I'm waiting to get past next week and kind of have a review of how everything with the open preparations and the event goes. July 1st, that maybe after the 4th week, looking at issuing that, so that project will get kick-started very soon. It's going to be lengthy, and I really look for you guys to have some involvement in that moving forward, but we're going to get started soon. Yep.
What generates the PDO review? I mean, what has changed that requires that now?
Well, it's actually a decision that had been made through a lot of the strategic planning process with council and senior leaders. Everyone here at this table who has had to administer one facet or another of that document will tell you that there's some changes we would like to see to help us do our job better. I do believe that it's largely in line with law. There's some sections that haven't been really updated. For one, I'm just going to say our sign regulations are woefully out of date and not in compliance with most recent case law. We don't interpret it. We know where we need to stop, where it regulates content, things of that nature. But we really need to fix it. It needs to be a lot more user-friendly document. It's been the framework we've had has been around since like the late 90s, early 2000s, and it's been patched, and, you know, the small area plan amendments that we did, you know, was another huge, exactly, thank you, Tom. So it is time for it to be, give it a real shot in the arm, and of course, as policy changes and direction changes, there's going to be a little bit different influence and look at different ways to approach certain zoning regulations where we can, where we can't. And of course, we got to stay ever vigilant with the changes to the enabling legislation and where our authority is or where it's not.
It's kind of like how many Band-Aids can you put on something before you got to rewrite it? This thing has been pretty well Band-Aided up, and it looks that way.
We've had a checklist internally that we've kept since probably early 2020. And it's a pretty detailed little table we put together of the chapter reference, the section, where there are a lot of cross-reference impacts, because it's just, you have to go to 3 or 4 different sections. And I know these 3 who have, Maria's been here with us now for a little over 2 years. Pam just hit her 1-year mark. Michael's coming up on it really soon. It's easy to overlook something because you have to go to 6 different spots to find what you really, everything you need. It'd be great if it were all housed in one section based on your classification too. That's some of the things that I'm really after. It's clunky, it's bulky. There's some areas there that set us up process and procedure wise. I think you're going to see staff come out of this with a lot of recommendations, and the consultant will too, I would hope, where some of our procedural requirements aren't really all that appropriate. Jimmy, Jeremy, Matt, and I talked with a lady, I believe she was with Chatham County. You know, they have a process there that puts their planning board in a really, really sticky and difficult position. So things like that, largely what we need to do to make it more operational.
Yeah, I remember us discussing that you had to jump around and look at different bits and pieces for the same thing.
Something
Okay,
to,
fair.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Something to, I guess, continue a conversation on, or a suggestion, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, and I know that work on staff gets overloaded, you know, and then it kind of comes in big waves for the board, but is, you know, a process for the future that provides maybe a continuation or a consistent revisiting of the PDO ordinances, maybe some of those from the list for the board, because in my understanding of the Planning and Zoning Board's roles is should be a continuous involvement of the PDO. So maybe after the big PDO rewrite, maybe there's an annual, something on the calendar, just a suggestion of where, you know, if 1 or 2 gets brought to the board, then the board then reviews any ordinance concerns or PDO concerns, just to continue that suggestion. We've had that discussion before. So
And it's
prefer to do than say.
And it's more appropriately initiated by the staff, because you guys, quite honestly, be thankful. You're not in all 10 of those chapters and 6 appendices every day like a lot of our staff. And I know, like, for instance, Kelly and Kim aren't here, but I have no problem speaking on their behalf. They got a laundry list, because those ladies, they live in some of those sections, and we're going to identify those. And I think it is appropriate, Jeremy. It's incumbent upon us that if there's something that's causing us heartburn, we need to initiate that and have an early conversation, planning board. Hey guys, we've noticed this. We think there's going to be some real opportunities to improve this document. We're going to work together on some drafts, and we're going to start working with you guys in work session, and then start that process, initiate it that way. Because there's only so many ways to buffer ordinance. I know a lot of you guys were here for that. I can't tell you how many times and scenarios we tried to think through in drafting that, and it's pretty good, but it certainly isn't great, and it darn sure isn't perfect. And the more opportunities we can have for folks like you guys to help vet us or vet that process, the better the outcome's going to be.
We would offer, just my suggestion is maybe the December meeting, we've always talked about the July meeting, what to do with it, so just some suggestions there. And again, it can be initiated by staff, but maybe a little bit more of a consistent, evolution of the PDO, because I know it stacks up on you. I know that list gets very, very long, and we've addressed some of them in the past.
It
We
can.
brought them up.
It can.
So, just suggestion.
That's how you end up where you are right now, is not doing what Jeremy said.
Yeah.
And you got to make sure there's support for those changes too.
I just want to make one comment on something I saw on slide 24, I think, where it talked about the composition of the board. I think there's when selecting members on a board like this, there's probably a desire to get people who are very astute in, certain things that come up here to the board. But then, it goes back to that influence thing that I think Maria was talking about. You get too many people who, feed their families through, whether they be directly or indirectly from decisions on the board, then consciously or subconsciously, you could be influenced in what your decision is. So I would I'm sure people were that, but just keep that in mind as you go forward, because several of us are leaving soon.
Right.
I'm sure people do the right thing.
Good word. With that,
I took your words away.
Alex got a little tear, I think, on that.
Make sure people do, boy, if we could.
Well, I will, the only thing I'll couple on to that with Paul and something that's supportive of is I will say that when we think of in the past of the makeup of the board, how the board works together in achieving not only for council, but also for staff. And I think that we always got to remember, we're here as a support for Alex and the team and their efforts every day of the job that they do. And I think how I cannot think back where I have any level of criticism towards the thought process to date in the effort that they have made to make sure that the board makeup is of the right people. So just kudos to that. So thank you for fighting the good fight.
And remember, the decision's not ours.
That's correct. That's correct. And that's where I was going with that. So
I wasn't talking to you, Alex. Meeting, right?
They'll appoint you even if we don't like you, so not our decision.
And I would say arguably no one in this community is more vested in having a wonderful relationship with our advisory boards than the staff you see come set before you. And when we can work as an extension of ourselves, the community is the ones who are going to benefit.
And I don't want to take with me, but I want to use this also to make another point, and sorry to prolong the meeting here, but obviously 160D defines the role of what we are to do. There's also some inside of the Pinehurst ordinances, we're also defined further. But I'd always argue that we are ultimately 9 citizens that provide a citizen voice for council. We have certain backgrounds and experiences that allow us to measure the PDO against the application in front of us. Because when staff comes together, when they have a proposal as well and an application, we're measuring, comprehensive plan, PDO, we're measuring all of that. So that's the opportunity for council to take and pick and choose. Whenever we send up a recommendation, they also can pick and choose the pieces and parts that are valuable to them.
Yeah.
So, we're a citizen voice. We are a measurement of PDO towards staff recommendation. We also measure the PDO against, the applicant's request, and they can pick and choose parts, pieces, all or none. So we do a good job of that, I think.
You should be the chair. You do well with that. That's good.
Sorry, I'll be quiet now.
No, that was well said. Speaking of meetings, next meeting date. We do have a regular meeting on July 11th. We have
do.
business.
It looks like we will. Pam's been working on a major site plan review, and I'm not going to tell you too much about it and ask Pam not to anyway, because I want you guys just to be salivating for a little over a month on what this may be and just what you can expect in this room.
It better be a little less than a month by the time we get some information.
It's not one that we've seen twice before, is it?
Not.
Okay.
Just as good.
And possibly a conventional rezoning. We're still buttoning that one up to see.
Exciting.
I think I might be out of town.
Yep. So we'll obviously communicate with the board as we get that in the focus. But yeah, it looks like you guys may be authorized to make one of these decisions that you learned about today.
Great.
Possibly two of them.
If no other comments, then call for a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Make a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Second.
Motion and second by Sonia and Jeremy. All in favor?
Aye.
Hereby adjourn the meeting at 5:11.
All right.